Hey, everybody. Just before we start, we want to take a moment to let you know that we're going to be having a discussion about some sensitive topics around eating disorders and possibly depression and suicide. So, if you are not in the headspace right now to listen to that, we totally understand and we want to support you in any way that we can. So, we might catch you on the next podcast. But if you're okay to listen, here's our show.
Hello, Megan.
Hello, Michelle.
Welcome to Spicy Brain
Podcast. Yeah.
where we are navigating neurodiversity with curiosity, joy, and radical acceptance.
Yeah.
So, we've been really diving into your ADHD brain, and we've been navigating some of the topics that are in the book called Driven to Distraction, which we recommend to everyone for sure to read. So usually I bring up a little topic. We dig into that brain of yours. We look at some strategies, and then we like to invite our community to comment. And our Facebook page, Spicy Brain Studios, is up and running. So please feel free to go in and comment and start these conversations. We really want to make sure we're all included on them. So today we have a topic that it's a little tough, I think, actually. And as someone who loves you, this one was tough for me as well. And I want us to kind of start with a couple years ago. I think we're almost at 3 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was 4, but you told us that you needed to get some help. And I thought maybe you could talk to us about what that was like and where you were at. And then we can kind of go in how that might relate to the ADHD brain in just a moment.
Yeah, it was actually longer than 3 years. It's been about
Wow.
6.
6.
Yeah,
Ugh.
I know, because we had the whole pandemic and
Yeah, I lost track. I'm sorry. Yeah,
no,
you're right.
it's
6.
true.
Wow.
So I've had a lot of, like, physical issues, a lot of weird neurological stuff going on that I didn't really always know about, and one of the things that kind of kept coming back was, is it real or is it trauma? And
Mm.
luckily, we because of my spouse, he's in the military, and one of the counselors on base actually recognized that I had potentially had PTSD.
Mm.
So I had a very clear moment in time where I was starting to have suicidal ideations. And I
Mm.
didn't know that's what they were, but I was like, yeah, sometimes I'm just driving and like I turn a corner and I think like, well, if I didn't turn, I would just go off the into the arroyo, and no one it
Mm.
wouldn't matter. And she's
Mhm.
like, "That's not okay." And so got me into
Yeah.
treatment very quickly. And I started doing a partially hospitalized program where you go, multiple days of the week. And that really kind of became my job, was to get better, because I just was in a really tough mental space. Because I think I do feel a lot more, and it just finally took its toll on me.
When
And
you were going to that, I'm sorry, I kind of interrupted, but when you were going to that, I remember you telling us you were going to go do this, but I didn't understand how serious it was for you. I mean,
yeah.
I knew, you had done some sort of counseling for many, many years. I was used to you going to counseling. That didn't seem new. This later, I sort of understood how different this was. So, what was this program about? What was it specifically for?
Well, this one was specifically for, I think it's just trauma in general, trauma
Mm.
that manifests in a way that, you're either having suicidal ideations, maybe you've attempted, or just where you're not able to really function anymore. And I think that
Mm.
that's the big difference, is that there's a clear delineation of trauma that is, like, everyone has trauma, but
Mhm.
whether or not you whether or not it's affecting your everyday life. And so for
Mm.
me, it began affecting my everyday life. And I think it was like 2013 was sort of when my physical symptoms got really bad, and it was all coming out through my body. And I had these, like, we weren't sure if I had dystonia or tics
Mhm.
or whatever it was. And someone had mentioned that it might be a, what do they say? It was like a cognitive behavioral disorder, something like that, where
Mhm.
it's like basically it's trauma.
Yeah,
And
and they're saying it's all in your head.
yeah,
What's interesting is if you're interested in seeing what Megan was going through on our YouTube channel, the Spicy Brain Studios YouTube channel, you actually have videoed yourself at that time.
yeah,
And we had gone to many neurologists, and it was very clear that the neurologists were stumped because they kept thinking that you were faking it, but then they did all of these tests and realized you weren't, but they couldn't figure out what it was.
yeah,
And I don't think any of them had had experience with trauma from childhood or earlier, earlier life manifesting itself in this physical way. That was pretty extreme.
yeah. It was very extreme.
Yeah, I mean, to the point that you would be debilitated for days on end. You would get stuck in postures. You were posturing in ways that would have been looked like dystonia or looked like Parkinson's or looked like many of these neurological disorders. And no one knew what to, your brain scans, everything came back fine, so to
Yeah.
speak, but it
Because
was happening.
in the end, like, it was actually happening in my brain, and my brain was
Mhm.
malfunctioning. So
Mhm.
it's just what was the impetus and the cause of the malfunction, I think, is different if you have dystonia versus, like, if you've got trauma. And,
Mhm.
they're doing a lot more research on this now, but even in 2013, it really wasn't they didn't it was two separate things. It was like there was neurological issues and then there was mental health issues. And they
Mm.
couldn't possibly go together. And I just always thought that was
Right.
such hubris to say like, "Oh, we haven't mapped, more than 10% of the brain and we think we know it all." So it was a
Mhm.
very hard time, and it was hard to say, "Oh, this is all in my head, and if it's all in my head, I'm doing this to myself." And there was a
Mhm.
lot of
Which
shame.
wasn't true. You weren't doing it to
Yeah.
yourself, but that's how you were left to feel.
Yeah, and because that's
Mhm.
basically like they couldn't as soon as the neurologist ruled out everything that they could think of, then they were like, "Well, sorry," and they just wiped their hands of it.
Yeah.
And that's really hard and frustrating. And so for me, I think because of that, because of moving so much as a military spouse and other traumas that had occurred, just like it was sort of one on top of the other. And then Brian deployed, and I had all these things that just hit one on top of the other. And I just couldn't deal with it anymore. I had
Mm.
shoved it aside as long as I possibly could, and then my body, like, it tried to come out through my body, and my body was, like, saying, "Hey, you need to deal with this," and I couldn't
Mm.
recognize the symptoms and, like, the understanding of that I needed to deal with that. And then my body was just like, "Okay, well, if you're not gonna come down if you're not gonna figure it out through your muscles moving, then I'm gonna like, your brain's gonna start shifting."
Mm.
And that's when I think I just flippantly mentioned it to our counselor on base. She is a family counselor, and she was like, "That sounds like classic PTSD." And now having
Mm.
been in the military and, like, working for the government, I recognize, like, there's so much more training that goes into talking about PTSD because so many people have it. And
Mhm.
I'm
You don't have to be in a war zone to have PTSD
no,
or have had to have been, yeah.
and the thing is like, we look at the fact that people have traumatic brain injuries,
Mhm.
especially in the military, and how if you have more traumatic brain injury and you're more likely to get PTSD, you could have a traumatic brain injury when you're a kid. I mean, I flipped over my handlebars and
Mhm.
I blacked out for 15 minutes. So that was a traumatic injury that,
Sure.
you know, could have, we just don't know enough about the brain. And that's the part that was frustrating. So having
Mm.
to get over that, that was part of, I think, what we call it PHP, the partially hospitalized program.
Mhm.
That's the one where you're not actually like you're not fully hospitalized, you're just partially. You're sort of
You're going home at the end of the day
yeah.
and, having somewhat of a normal life, but you're spending a great deal of your day working on this.
Yeah. No, yeah, and you're spending a lot of time at home working on it. And I think at the time, all of my trauma was sort of wrapped up in the family and in not
Mhm.
the me being a kid, my youth.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
I couldn't separate you guys from what was actually going on. And so I think that's part of the reason why I didn't really like, I didn't even realize that I didn't let you guys know how bad it was because I don't think I
Yeah.
was in a place to even say it. I just
Sure.
was talking to Brian and be like, "I gotta get help. We need to deal with this." And I had to advocate to him on some level because he was supposed to go to some massive training that, like, the military pays for, and it was 3 days before he had to leave, and we had just seen our counselor, and she's like, "You need to tell your first sergeant about this, and they need to take care of this and take care of your spouse." And he's like, "Well, I
Mm.
don't know." And I was like, luckily, I knew enough about the military at that point that I could advocate for myself and
Yeah.
say, "No, I need you here. You need to talk to your first sergeant. It's gonna happen." Like, I know that he's there to help me too. And that for me was like the first time I
Mm.
really used my voice, not knowing that I was using my voice, but I was. Like, I was saying, "I need help, and this person is actually there to help me, and I know they are, and you're gonna contact them right now." And
Yeah.
he did, and
Mm.
I was I wanted to go to, like, a hospital and just, like, not have to deal with
Yeah.
life, and then
Yep.
they're like, "No, you need to do this partially hospitalized thing," and I was like, "Ugh," it wasn't what I wanted, but I was like, "Let's just go do it." It was the best thing I've ever done for myself. It was the start
Mm.
of me finally growing into my own skin, learning about myself. It wasn't the magic
Mm.
bullet, but it definitely was a beginning. And while I was there, they had a they had their trauma track, and they also had an eating disorder track. And for me,
Mm.
I I resonated. They recognized some things, and I realized that I also had an eating disorder. And
Mm.
it all kind of started to make sense because trauma, eating disorders, and disorders in general are they're really surrounded around trauma. You don't
Mm.
you don't put on these things are there to help keep you safe. And the best example I ever heard was when I first met Brian, we went and saw a chaplain on base, and he was trying to explain to Brian like how trauma works inside people's bodies. And he said,
Mm.
"Okay, well, think about like when you deploy and you have like," he mentioned all this like gear. He's like, "You have this vest that you put on that's like Kevlar, for
Mhm.
protecting yourself." It's like, "So what do you have to
Yeah,
do when?"
bulletproof vest.
Yeah. He says, "What do you have
Yeah.
to do to your bulletproof vest when you put it on?" He's like, "Well, you have to tighten it down. You gotta tighten it down." He's like, "Yeah, why do you have to tighten it down?" It's like, "Well,
Mm.
because if there's an explosion, the explosion will reverberate off my chest. If it's not tight, then it can actually like destroy the insides of you or something. Like, so it's a protection to do that."
Mhm.
He's like, "Great.
Yeah.
Now imagine you have this Kevlar on and you are strapped in. What happens if you were to go and try to live your normal life in Kevlar? To like
Mm.
try to get into a car." He's like, How would that be?" And he's like, "Oh, that would be terrible. Like you can't really function and move with that Kevlar on." And he's like, "Yes, exactly." So what's happening with
Mm.
trauma is that there are these things that help us to survive whatever war is going on in our minds and around us. And so we
Sure.
we take these tools, and sometimes they're not the most healthy tools, but they are healthy in the moment because they helped you survive. And so my
Yeah.
eating disorder helped me survive as long as I did. And then
Yeah.
when I went to go start having a normal life and it started to affect normal life, that's when it became a disorder. That's when it became a
Mm.
problem. So it's a really hard thing to separate. This thing was really important for me to save me and keep me here, and I wanna thank myself for being able to be strong enough to still
Yeah.
be here on this earth, but
Yes.
also I can let it go now.
Mm. It served me then, but it isn't serving me now.
Right.
So, I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that. Anyone who's listening to this, hearing somebody tell their story and tell it so in such a vulnerable way, but also after having processed it, right? Like, it's not, you're not telling us this for the first time for me,
Right.
but for others, they might, this might be the first time they're hearing it. And I think when I remember hearing your story for the first time, it it impacted me so fully because, of course, I was part of your trauma. And, that's never something somebody you love you want to hear.
Yeah.
Right. And that took me a long time to be able to figure out how to own that. Yes, I was part of that. And also, I could also be part of your recovery.
Yeah.
And we didn't know, right? I didn't know at the time that you were kind of not sure if I was going to be part of your recovery. And I think that's everyone has to make those decisions for themselves in terms of their family and what makes sense and what doesn't. And if people are willing to go on that journey with you. But hearing it was rough
Yeah.
and it was hard. And there were a lot of things that had to change and little things that you think are no big deal and other things that are just like, you know, fundamentally change your relationship. Right.
Yeah.
And so as you're saying this, I'm thinking, there were so many things about you being ADHD that we normally would tease about or mention or whatever it was. And it was just because, well, that's Megan. And it was never, we never really fully understood what you were going through on
Yeah.
a day to day basis. And even in the last like 6 years, I don't think it's been until this last year, us doing this podcast, that I think I'm much more empathetic to it. And yet I still find myself, there's some days where I fall back into, well, can't you just,
Yeah.
and that, how hard that is for you every day to have to deal with it your own self, but then to have other people not really being there empathizing with you or not really being on the journey with you. And so one of the things that they talked about in this book was this idea that there's a tendency towards addictive behaviors for people with ADHD. The trauma is the trauma, I think, right? Like, I would imagine, how would everybody with ADHD not have some I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I would imagine it's rampant anyway
Yeah.
because of so many
I
things.
I would think that you'd have to be a unicorn and have
Yeah.
family who already
Got
understood
it.
it from the day you were
Yes.
born.
Yeah.
And even then, it's interesting that, like, one of the things that was told to me was that you can have trauma around, like, let's say, school and friends and outside influences that are really hard and difficult things you have to go through. But
Mhm.
if you've got that support system at home, it
Yeah.
it's only a small trauma, right? Like it's like
Yeah.
someone had said every child is like a glass bowl, and
Mm.
the question is how much damage does your family and your surroundings do to the glass bowl? Does it just crack it? Does it like just, chip it,
Mm.
or does it completely shatter it?
Mm.
And a lot of times, like, I think I had just so many little cracks in my bowl, just tons and tons and tons of
Yeah.
cracks. And I ended up, I was still all together, but it only took like a light breeze to like just make the whole thing fall apart. But then
Yeah.
it reminds me of this bowl that actually Titi gave us, our great aunt,
Mm.
who is
Mm.
in Portuguese, mom's Portuguese, and it's we call her Titia, but I could never pronounce Titia, so we always called her Titi. And
Yeah.
she gave me this beautiful pink frosted glass bowl that was like, I loved it. I thought it was so pretty. I loved touching
Mm.
it, and she knew I loved it, so she gave it to me. And I remember just like feeling so seen when she gave that bowl to me. And
Mm.
and I had it for years and years and years, and then at some point I think I was like in high school, and I dropped it, and it like got a crack.
Mm.
And I remember just being so devastated that I ruined it. And at some point through this process of going to PHP, I realized, and I first of all, I kept the bowl with me. I still had it
Mm. Yeah.
broken, like, not sure what to
Yeah.
do with it. And so I decided like one of the projects would be that I would take the bowl and I would smash it up even more and
Mm,
redefine what it was. And so it became filler in a beautiful vase for me.
mm.
And it was still there and it was still a part, but it was just transformed. And I feel like that's a lot of like what happened to me. It's like I had to just like completely just okay, start from scratch almost. Like I have all these pieces of me, but I have to transform how I'm going to use those pieces.
Yeah. I mean, when you say that, it's like that's such a beautiful analogy, right? Of having to break yourself up and reconfigure and figure out where all those pieces fit now.
Yeah.
That some pieces of the family and some pieces of the relationship worked,
Yeah.
and some of it really didn't. And some of the behaviors you were having worked and some didn't, and having to like reconfigure all of that. And I definitely did it in a different way, but I definitely had to do and am having to do something very similar. And I don't think that is particularly because for me of specifically around anything of neurodivergency, but it's like I do think it is when you do have family struggles, right? And family trauma, then there's so much to that. So then you add on ADHD, where you have this sense of lack of confidence potentially, and
Yeah.
sense of that you don't fit in and you're not doing it the right way, and all of that on top of what was already a difficult situation, I
Mhm.
think. And I wonder too, because it's generational, right? Oftentimes, right, we've established that, we've learned, at least over the course of this podcast, that it's something that's passed down.
Yeah.
And things like alcoholism and all of these other disorders tend to be also passed down. I wonder how many of these disorders, and the alcoholism, the gambling, what other things, sex addiction, the different addictions
Mhm.
are connected more to ADHD than we really understand. Right? And then if you're addicted to something and it's causing a dysfunction in your family life, right? Then all these traumas can happen. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the chicken or the egg particularly, but when you think about how you came to the idea of with your eating disorder, how do you connect that to your ADHD at all? Do you see that as a separate thing?
I had never really considered it during my recovery.
Mm,
Uh, as we've been talking about this more and kind of, you had given me a heads up about this topic last week. And I think for me, it is how do I explain this? Like, there's this desire for dopamine. And from my understanding, and I could be wrong because we're not a health channel.
no, we're not experts on this,
So
any of this
so
for
I
sure.
could be way wrong, but
Yeah.
from my understanding, it's like sugar is sort of a cheap dopamine. It sort
Mm,
of acts as dopamine, or like it does the same thing, or it like. But food can provide a dopamine hit, especially if it's like if it tastes good and if it
mhm,
satiates. If I'm thinking about it, like I think I kind of became addicted to this like easy way to get dopamine.
mm,
And so then I would eat and I would overeat and I would just keep eating even though I was still tired. I was still, full, but I needed that sensation, that feeling.
hmm,
Cuz I had the dual thing where I was when I was much younger, like I would overeat. And then when I moved to Los Angeles, I started becoming anorexic.
mm,
So, like I went from one extreme to the other. And I think the like going down a rabbit hole, it's really easy to go down the fitness,
mm,
healthy wellness rabbit hole. And they have a new distinction now with eating disorders. It's called orthorexia. And that's like where you are addicted to the culture of getting better, getting healthy, doing these very extreme things where every morning you have to get up and drink a glass of warm, lemon water. And if you don't, you're going to have the worst day ever, or like all these detoxes you're
Mm.
going to be doing and every new thing, you're so into it that like you can't even go and have, let's say, a piece of cake with your friends at their birthday. And I think that's what it
Mm.
comes down to with any of these disorders is that it's fine to love eating, right? Like I enjoy eating
Mhm.
now, which I didn't before, but
Hmm.
it's a difference of like, can I still function in my daily life? If you enjoy going to Vegas and playing some gamble, doing some playing some gambling, you can tell how often I do that. Uh, or if you enjoy going to a sporting event, or I mean, honestly,
Mm.
anything. This is what I learned about trauma is that anything done in an extreme can be an addiction and a form
Mm.
of trauma. Like I had a friend who was she's an amazing cyclist, like just world
Mm.
class cyclist, but that's how she, channeled her trauma and her
Mm.
eating disorder. So
Hmm.
we look at these things and think like, "Oh, these people are so healthy." And it's like, "But are they?" Like if you
Right.
can't stop and like have a regular life outside of this one thing,
It
that's
might be something to look at.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because it
And
could be affecting, like, your health, it could be affecting your relationships, it's yeah, and
yeah.
I would think with somebody with ADHD, that impulsivity piece, that's hard to tamp tap down or, dampen, I guess is the word I'm looking for, but hard to dampen that impulsivity that you get interested and excited about learning about something, and then you might go down that rabbit hole,
Oh, yeah, I
right?
totally so, like, one of the things I've been doing is I've been cleaning my house, and when I
Mm,
do, I listen to these podcasts and different there's a guy whose name is The Diary of a CEO, and so he's got all these fascinating people on, and, some lady came on talking about she's called the glucose goddess, and so she
mm.
talked all about, sugar and how bad sugar is for you, and after listening to that, like, I literally had to check in with my nutritionist multiple times, over the last
You're
month.
like, "Oh my god, I'm gonna change everything."
I felt that
Yeah.
desire, like, I mean, and I've done
Yeah.
this, like, when we had COVID,
Yes.
I
Mhm.
completely changed the way we ate, completely. I, like,
Mm.
went from just a normal they call it the SAD diet, standard American diet, and I went to, like, a total plant-based diet, and I was like, "We have to do it this way, and it has to be perfect," and that's when I started realizing, like, I need to be back with a nutritionist because I don't think I'm I think I'm going
Yeah.
down that route, and so I found somebody who is
Mm.
phenomenal with eating disorders, like, not you have to get somebody you can't just go to a regular nutritionist who's giving you information, you
Mhm.
have to have somebody who understands the recovery part of it. And so I've been talking with her, Caitlin. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi,
I can
Caitlin.
I can out myself, my HIPAA self, but I've been talking to her and I was like, oh my God, I think I'm starting to feel that impulsivity, that itch of like, I can't have
Mm.
any fruit, because the lady was even talking about fruit and how like that
Mm.
can be challenging. And it's like certain types of fruit are higher in sugar. And so we had to like kind of go through it. So like I had an entire thing of beautiful strawberries that I didn't eat because I
Mm.
heard this podcast and I was like, can I
Oh.
eat these strawberries now? Like, and they went rotten in my fridge. These
Oh, that's
beautiful
horrible.
strawberries.
Oh.
And so I had to like so I have that
Mm.
impulsivity of like wanting to listen, and I told her, I was like, "I think I need to stop listening to this guy." Like, I
Yeah.
think I need to
Yeah. Right, just because it wasn't good for you, not that he's not a good for
yeah.
somebody else, but just for you, it just
Yeah,
doesn't.
it's just and it's again, like, if someone chose not to listen to this podcast because of our
Yeah.
warning at the beginning, like, that's okay, and everyone's going through
Yeah.
their own process and their own recovery the way they need to, but I I feel that impulse, like, the other day I
Mm.
got some I had to get Halloween candy because it was on
Mm.
sale, and I'm like, "I should never do that until, like, the week before because I have Milky Ways in my house," and I was like, "These are
Mm.
delicious." And so I know that I shouldn't be eating that many of them, but they just taste so good that I can't stop. And I
Mm.
just keep eating them, even though I know full
Yeah.
well that I shouldn't.
But that can happen with you with almost anything,
Yes.
right? So, like, food is one thing, but that drink could be that way, and if you did get into gambling, it could be that way, and if you
And
right? I
I'm
mean,
lucky, yes, it could be, and I'm very
yeah.
lucky that, like, drugs do not work with me on the same way that people do.
Yeah.
Like, people who take.
Because they say that people with ADHD sometimes are more sensitive to those drugs, to drugs in general and
Yeah.
alcohol in general. So they tend to have that impulsivity piece that's like, oh, I want to feel that way again. I want to feel that high, that dopamine hit again.
Yeah, because that's kind of what flow is. Flow is sort of like a high. It's a little bit of a hit,
Mm.
and if you're trying to
And we talked
manufacture
about
that.
flow on one of the other podcasts where you just are like in it. And work can be a dopamine hit
Yeah.
too for people, right? Like you can have that addiction to work.
And this is the key part, is that anything can be addictive.
Mm,
The question is how does it affect your daily life? And so
right.
I had this clear moment in PHP where I was, they had like a specific eating plan you could do. And I added alcohol instead of
Mm,
having other things. And so I was worried at one point. I'm like, am I an alcoholic now? Because I'm like I've just substituted one vice for another. And
yeah.
they went through with me, and they listened, and we talked about it, and they're like, Megan, look, here's the difference. Like, there are very clear markers that you have to hit in order to be an alcoholic, and you don't hit those. The only thing is that you just replaced one vice for another. It does not make
Mm,
you an alcoholic, and of course you're going to worry about it because you have these issues, and like you're
yeah.
worried, but it
And
was.
also you're ADHD, so you incessantly worry anyway.
Yes.
Yes. So
So,
obviously anybody you're working with, you would want to let them know you have ADHD because
well,
that's going
and
to
but they may
impact
not
your
even know
treatment.
though. They never even
Right.
mentioned it to me, right? I mean,
Wow.
I
Wow.
think this is the challenge, is that, like, having these, and this is why okay, let me stop. This is what I like to do. I have one thought, I don't
Yeah,
finish
go
it, I go
ahead.
on to the
That's
next
okay.
one.
Yeah.
Um, this is why I'm such an advocate for speaking up for yourself, and this is also why I wanna
Mm,
do this podcast, is that, like, hopefully we can just educate more people, and more people can become educated, and it's a
mhm.
snowball effect after a while, that we
Mm,
need to look at this. I mean, we need to look at PTSD. We need to look at ADHD. We need to be looking at, all these different quote unquote disorders, and understand where people are coming from. Because, nowadays I am sort of like the PTSD suicide expert. So,
mhm.
they'll people on base, they'll be like, "Hey, I'm worried about this person." And so we send them and get them help. But also if there's like questions of, "Hey, this what does this sound like to you?" And it's like, "Well, that doesn't sound like I'm worried about someone." I'm like, "Hey, well, tell me what they're saying." And okay, like I'm not worried about them just yet. Right? Like, keep an eye on
Mhm.
them, keep talking with them. If they start doing X, Y, and Z, then that's when you need to start worrying. So,
Yeah.
like, being able to just understand it and make it more part of normal conversation, so it's not this stigma.
Yes. It was interesting. We started the podcast over because my original time, I was like in this word salad, not really able to get out my normal intro. And I think we kind of figured out that it was really because it wasn't mine
Mm,
to hold some of this. And I was feeling sort of awkward about it and not sure kind of how to even bring it up, even though we have talked about this trauma PHP experience. I've met many of the people that you ended up connecting with on
mhm.
that. We've talked about your eating disorder. We've not had Thanksgiving together. We've had Thanksgiving together. We've done all the things, right?
Yeah,
Like over the years. And I still felt this little bit of, ooh, I'm going to bring up this topic that maybe is going to be a little bit volatile, and how important it is for us to kind of get over that
yeah.
as a
Well,
world, right?
as a society, because you're right, like, it's this taboo conversation. Even just me having ADHD was taboo back in the day, and no one wanted to talk about it, and it's like, I don't understand why we can't discuss these things, it's like,
Yeah.
uh God love Brian's sister, but, like, and when we got married, she says, "Never say the D word." That was her advice to us, and I was like, "What? Divorce? Divorce, 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 divorce." I'm like, we're gonna talk about this, because if we can't talk
Yeah.
about it, then, like, we're definitely gonna have that happen." And I just talk about it all the time. Like, I don't care who
Mm.
knows the experiences I've had, because if someone's gonna use that against me, then I can't stop them anyways from using it against me. And
Yeah.
I'm not gonna sit in fear of other people, right? Until I'm not like, if someone has an issue, they can come and talk to me, and that's on
Mhm.
them to come and talk to me. And I
Yeah.
think that up until this point, like, going through PHP, I had to realize that there's this thing called a victim triangle or the
Mm.
drama triangle. Okay, again,
It's okay.
we're
You're
not a
not an expert,
psychiatry.
but it's a triangle
The
of some
triangle,
sort.
and
And
it's
what's the
like,
triangle do? Yeah.
yeah, and it's like there's this idea that, if you see yourself as a victim in life,
Mm.
you can take all of those attributes and you can use them for positivity, right?
Mm.
So if someone is normally like the coach and is trying to fix everybody, well, they can then take that fixingness and they want to like become an advocate. So
Mm.
you're changing the way that you have these very strong skills that you can use for a more healthy, you turn into the healthy triangle. It must be
Yeah.
drama. So, there's this is the part for me that is so important, and I just don't care if people know, and I talk about this to, like, pretty much everyone that I meet, and so, yeah, it's funny, like, it didn't even occur to me that it would be awkward for you to even bring it up. E
I didn't either, which was interesting, right? And
Yeah,
I think it's more thinking about other people listening to this for the first time, and
yeah,
anyone who cares about you or has grown to care about you might have an emotional response, and we're not there to be there with them,
yeah,
right? Necessarily. I mean, we do. Obviously, we've got our Facebook page and we would love to have conversation around this and make sure that, people get help if needed as well. But I really am so, you know, proud to be your sister, because I do know that, you introduced me to therapy. You were the first one. You're the youngest and you were the first. And you
yeah.
did braved all these waters ahead. And I didn't know what PTSD was for a civilian. I
No.
mean, I'd heard about it with military. I didn't know I had PTSD. So, oh my gosh, wow, that's super helpful. And so you go through this, and, I figured out my own pathway. It wasn't the same as yours in terms of how we kind of have been dealing with that, but it
Yeah,
was really helpful. And I think I am changed not having that, jacket, the bulletproof vest trauma jacket on, all the time. And I think I'm much more open now because of it. Again, still a work in progress for sure.
yeah, both
But
of us.
but yeah, because I still do get triggered on things, and I still do have that reverberation of like I'm not feeling safe or not feeling grounded or not feeling, but I'm able to recognize it more quickly now, I think. And I think anybody who has had ADHD, I would think you would have had many more opportunities to have been traumatized in your life
Yeah,
than those that aren't, is my guess. And
and the
and
traumas
rightfully so.
the traumas feel bigger, right? Or, I
Yeah.
mean, well, bigger's not the right word, but, like, they impact, they hit hard.
Yeah.
So, you have a bunch of these
The
little traumas.
intensity is different for people with ADHD, I think, right? Like we talk about those waves. Sometimes we talk about sound waves a lot because you and I are doing podcasting things, but these waves of energy or emotion, I think the amplitude, how high the waves are, and anybody obviously who's been dealing with any of these surges and water you can think about, it's a tsunami of waves,
And a
of
frequent tsunami.
emotions,
I think
and a
that's the other
frequent
thing.
one.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's coming at you all day long, all the time.
because you
And
can
so,
hyper focus on it. It's
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I feel like this particular podcast kind of for me brought all these different symptoms. We couldn't have talked about this
Oh, yeah, no.
in the way we are right now had we not done the work of educating ourselves as to what ADHD is. And so I think in terms of this particular symptom of having more likelihood of having addiction issues, a really huge piece is educating yourself as to what ADHD is, and helping your family and the people who love you understand it, and anybody who's going to attempt to help you to understand you have it, if you know you do, or
Yeah.
even if you're wondering if you do, to get tested. So that, I think it's hard to do even therapy if people don't understand that you have ADHD, because some of these things wouldn't make sense until you understand that that's this invisible disorder potentially, right?
No, that's a good point. Yeah, because like, I've just been so undeniably ADHD, I didn't have to, like
Yeah,
I
prove
didn't
it
have
to
to prove it.
anybody
Yeah, it was like,
or
"Oh, yeah,
show everyone's like, "Oh, yeah,
she's
she's
ADHD."
ADHD. Look at her.
Mhm.
She's sitting there jumping like a little bean in my office or something," right? Yeah.
Exactly. It's, like,
Yeah.
pretty obvious. Well,
Yeah.
and something you said about like, people hearing this story and us not being there to help them through it,
Mm.
it
Mhm.
resonated with me because in my mind, I I'm okay if people hear my story and if they have a hard time with it because that means that they're feeling and that they're listening
Mm.
and that's okay. It's okay for people to have a difficult time with something, but it's also okay for us to reach out to each other and talk about it. And to say to somebody like, "Hey, I just heard this thing and it impacted me and why did it impact me?" One of the first things that really made me realize I had anger issues before I knew I had PTSD was that we watched the movie Anger Management. And
Mm.
it's supposed to be a funny show and it really messed with me.
Mm.
And so being able to take that and start having that conversation of like, wow, this was really a dark, I'm noticing so much about myself or I'm not like I'm having this
Yeah.
weird reaction that no one else is having. Why
Right. Why
why
isn't everyone else freaking out about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it's an opportunity to be curious,
Mm.
the emotions that we're having when we listen or when we talk, it's always just a moment to be curious about ourselves and what we resonate with and maybe what we resonate for somebody else we love.
Absolutely. I am very curious about other people in our community and if they've had experiences either with PTSD or with addiction and
Yeah.
addictive behaviors and what they've done to help themselves and help those that they love. Because I think there's a lot of ways to go through it. Therapy is definitely one way. We always recommend anyone to seek out that kind of support because I think it can be very beneficial, but also having community of people that you can rely on and count on is super important. And I know one of our goals is to really foster that community and hopefully create a space, a safe space,
Yep.
where we can have these conversations. We can be vocal advocates. We can find our voices, and we can also help each other be curious about how we radically accept the things in our lives that are true about our brains and
Yeah.
hopefully do it with joy. Do it with joy.
Yeah. Joy, curiosity, and radical acceptance.
Yeah. Thank you, Bub. Love you.
I love you too. Bye.
Bye.
If you or anyone you love is struggling with suicide or suicidal ideations, you can call 988, and that's the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. So you can call 988, available 24/7. Also, if you are having issues with eating disorders or you feel like you might need to talk to somebody, you can text NEDA to 741-741. That's NEDA to 741-741. They'll give you some immediate support and help you manage your feelings and behaviors. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Spicy Brain Podcast, brought to you by Spicy Brain Studios. This series has us focusing more specifically on ADHD and the symptoms list we got from the book Driven to Distraction. If you found this episode as impactful or vulnerable, as Michelle and I felt it was, please share it with someone you think would benefit from the conversation. Make sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to so that you can be notified each week. Now, next week, we will be talking about the tendency towards the inaccurate self-observation. You don't accurately gauge your impact on others, which is probably why I'm always reminding people of who I am in any email. So come back next week to find out all about my inaccuracies. But until then, here's to a great end of the week, and remember to stay curious.